The nuptials of darkness on a crisp September morning. The air seemed clean, and the church bells sounded brighter than usual. The hamlet of Lillingham had not experienced such excitement in years. Almost everyone in the village seemed to be chatting about the same topic. Everybody was decked up in their finest attire and talking trash about the upcoming wedding of Evelyn Whitmore and Charles Denham, son of the powerful Denham family who owned half the acreage surrounding Lillingham, while sitting by the parlour window of her little cottage on Church Lane. Miss Marple was delicately knitting a pale blue shawl. Her hands were busy, but her ears were wide open. Earlier that morning, she had received 3 phone calls from friends who were simply relaying information they had heard. Supposedly, on the morning of Evelyn Whitmore's wedding, a mysterious package arrived brought by a boy on a bicycle wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside was a delicate, old-fashioned black laced veil, accompanied by a small note that read, "For the true bride only." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully, her mind racing with the mystery. Evelyn, orphaned at 3, had been raised by her great-aunt Beatrice in the ivy-covered manor at the edge of the village. She was known for her poise, her beauty, and her soft manners, but Miss Marple had always thought there was something uncertain in the girl's eyes, as if she were trying very hard to belong by 11. The church was filled, the pews creaked as guests leaned and whispered their voices, hushed but eager. The Denhams, seated in the front row, looked stately in navy and pearl. Behind them sat the villagers, the greengrocer, the post mistress, even old Mr. Bradbury, who hadn't left his house in months, was wheeled in by his niece Miss Marple sat quietly near the back. Then came the hush. The organ began to play softly, and heads turned towards the door. The first bridesmaid entered, then the second, and then Evelyn. She was breathtaking in ivory silk, her dark hair swept into a soft chin, and her eyes lowered modestly. But what caught everyone's attention, what made the murmurs rise, was the veil. It was black. Black lace fine as cobwebs, edged in tiny black beads that caught the light like dewit, flowed down the back of her dress, like a shadow. Some thought it strange, some thought it elegant, only as the ceremony commenced. Charles Denham exuded an air of self-assurance, while Miss Marple scowled and cocked her head. Just as Evelyn was about to hold her bouquet aloft, the priest said, "Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" And a short smile escaped her lips. Evelyn opened her mouth and stopped. She blinked, swayed slightly, then dropped the bouquet. Gasps filled the air. Evelyn's knees buckled. She clutched her stomach, made a strange sound like a hiccup, and fell forward onto the stone floor of the chancel. Her veil pulled around her head like ink spreading through water. There was chaos. The vicar stepped back. Charles knelt beside her, shouting her name. The bridesmaids burst into tears. Someone called for the doctor, but Miss Marple, seated calmly and unnoticed, watched the scene without panic. Her pale blue eyes had fixed themselves on Evelyn's collar, where a tiny frayed loop of thread stuck out from the fastening at her neck. By the time Dr. Langley arrived, Evelyn was no longer breathing. "There's no wound," he muttered, checking her pulse. "No swelling, no sign of poisoning. It must be a fainting spell, perhaps a heart condition she didn't know she had." But Evelyn had never been ill in her life, at least not that anyone knew. By mid-afternoon, the church was empty. The guests had been quietly dismissed. The Denhams had gone home in silence, and the veil, the black lace veil, had been folded and taken away by one of the bridesmaids while walking home. Miss Marple pondered the events of the previous day. It wasn't simply the collapse that had impacted Evelyn. It was the sudden widening of her eyes, as if something had squeezed her unexpectedly. Then there was the strange note, the unwelcome veil, the perfect health, and something else. Something smaller. The seamstress, Mrs. Daltrey, last week, the village dressmaker, informed Miss Marple that she would not be making Evelyn's gown. Miss Marple was taken aback by the news and set aside her knitting. She walked to her little desk, where she jotted down a single line. About a bride who wasn't actually the bride, a gift for someone else, or perhaps something else entirely. Looking out the window, she noticed that the village had become unusually quiet. However, deep down, Miss Marple knew that the peace wouldn't endure until she discovered who had sent the veil and why. Evelyn Whitmore had to die wearing it. The following day, she had tea at the vicarage, and the next day, the village was unusually quiet. Shops opened late, and the curtains remained drawn. Lillingham seemed to be holding its breath when the church bell failed to ring at all. Nevertheless, Miss Marple adhered to her usual routine. Following a light breakfast and a tidying up of her garden roses, she set off along the lane toward the vicarage. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Harmon, had called the night before, her voice a mix of concern and curiosity. "Jane, please come tomorrow," she whispered. "It's all so strange. The vicar refuses to speak about it, saying it's unchristian to speculate. Mrs. Harmon, however, was born to speculate. She just favors doing it over shortbread and china cups." The vicarage was a charming Georgian house, adorned with ivy and filled with the pleasant aroma of lemon polish in the hallway. As they entered the parlour, Mrs. Harmon guided Miss Marple to the silver tea service that was already set out. A delicate clock ticked away on the mantelpiece, adding to the atmosphere. The fire, though unnecessary in the late summer warmth, crackled and provided a welcome distraction from the day's uneasy mood. "Well," Mrs. Harmon said, her voice quivering, "I dare say you saw it yourself. The veil ghastly, wasn't it?" "I thought it rather beautiful," she replied with calmness, "though certainly not fitting for a wedding, but yes, odd, particularly the timing. I don't mean to sound cruel, but some say Evelyn was never quite right to perfect. To polish no trace of her mother or father in her. No one really knew them, did they?" Mrs. Harmon leaned forward and passed the sugar bowl without asking. "You know what they're saying, don't you, about the note that read for the true bride only?" She whispered something that sounded pointed, as if someone wanted her to know something, as if Evelyn weren't a true bride. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes filled with contemplation. With her great-aunt gone and Evelyn no longer in the picture, there are very few people who could possibly know the truth. Mrs. Harmon lowered her voice and pointed to the veil, saying, "Did you notice how tightly it was fastened? It took Charles nearly a minute to get it off her." "Did it?" Miss Marple's expression hardened into a question. The vice president informed her later that the veil was knotted in the back, not just pinned. Miss Marple chose not to comment, choosing to keep the detail to herself. The two women were silent for a while, the sound of crackling fire breaking gently. "You'll think me awful for saying this, but I've never liked that Denham boy," Mrs. Harmon whispered. Miss Marple added gently. They sat in quiet as the china clicked softly as Miss Marple set her cup down. "The Denhams own half the village," Evelyn said with a hint of pride. "If she had lived long enough to say her vows, the land her great-aunt left would have passed to Charles's husband," whispered Mrs. Harmon. "However, now that she is unmarried, the land belongs to the family trust controlled by the groom's father." "One more thing," whispered Mrs. Harmon. "There was someone at the wedding who wasn't on the guest list." With an arched eyebrow, Miss Marple, a woman with a sharp chin, tall dark hair, and a similar age to Evelyn, sat alone in the back row. "I noticed her because she didn't look away when Evelyn collapsed. Did you speak to her?" "I saw her walk away just as the doctor was arriving. She didn't cry or appear shocked. She simply left." "Margaret, your keen observational skills are evident." Mrs. Harmon blushed with pleasure. "I may not always be as perceptive as you are, but I do my best. Thank you for the tea. It has been immensely helpful. I think I'll take a walk through the cemetery. Sometimes the dead leave better clues than the living. It seems to me that the dead leave better clues than the living. I wonder if it was murder. Mrs. Harmon blinked. You seem to believe it was murder. Within the victorage, the church stood silently under the bright sky, its spire casting a long shadow over the graves below. Miss Marple walked slowly along the winding path between the headstones, her gloved hands clasped gently behind her back. She paused at one of the older stones worn smooth by wind and time. She didn't answer directly, but smiled. The story of a bride who never finished her vows, a black veil, and an unknown guest is enough to justify a little curiosity, doesn't it? A cherished daughter, Evelyn Maud Whitmore, was born in 1911 and passed away in 1916. Emily Whitmore's face contorted into a grimace as Miss Marple, even while the name sounded familiar. This Evelyn was not the one who had recently passed away, rather, it belonged to someone else entirely. Long ago, there was another Evelyn Whitmore. She was 5 years old. Someone had been here, remembered her, and maybe even made sure there would never be two Evelyns. The headstone had just been polished, and flowers and violets had been set at its base. In Chapter 3, The Forgotten Grave, Miss Marple's mind races with names. Names reused, uninvited guests, and a murder that is hiding in plain sight. To solve the mystery, she must speak with the seamstress, and maybe even the post office. No mystery, in her experience, begins without a trail, no matter how faint, and no murderer can hide their tracks as well as they think they can. The following morning, a gentle mist enveloped Lillingham, casting a misty mist that seemed to float on the wind. The cobblestone streets were silent and moist, with dew clinging to the hedgerows like little pearls. Underwater umbrellas and whispers were the order of the day, as was the weather that Miss Marple often linked with mysteries. After breakfast, she returned to the churchyard, her walking shoes crunching gently across the gravel path. She stood again before the grave of Evelyn Maud Whitmore. The girl who had passed away in 1916 was remembered with fresh violets. She knelt down and gently touched the petals, feeling the cool dampness. It couldn't have been more than an hour ago that someone had been carefully tending to the girl's grave. She didn't have to wait long for an answer. The church caretaker, an elderly woman named Mrs. Bell, arrived, pushing a creaky wheelbarrow full of tools and dry moss. Despite her advanced years, Mrs. Bell appeared alert and focused. "Miss Marple," she said, adjusting her headscarf, "are you looking at the little one's grave again?" Standing tall, Miss Marple declared, "I am a very sad stone, but well kept." Miss Bell let out a weary sigh, saying, "I've been that way a long time. Violet Linton leaves flowers every Tuesday. She never skips." "Violet Linton," Miss Marple whispered again, "resides alone on Holly now. The poor thing was responsible for Miss Beatrice Evelyn's great-aunt. You know, I do." When Miss Marple asked if Violet had ever cared for the girl who had just died, Mrs. Bell nodded. From the time she was a baby, Violet was like a nurse, feeding, changing, and taking her on walks. After Beatrice took full custody, Violet raised Evelyn almost like her own. When asked if Violet had ever mentioned the child buried here, Mrs. Bell hesitated, but she eventually spoke up, saying, "Only one of them sleeps here." Chills ran down my spine as Miss Marple redirected her attention to the stone, adding, "And no one ever asked what she meant." "People don't like to ask about the dead," said Mrs. Bell quietly. "Especially in a village like this, it's better." to let the past rot. Miss Marple, however, was not one to let things remain undisturbed. She thanked Mrs. Bell and continued on her way to Holly End, where Violet Linton's cottage stood. The cottage was nestled between two overgrown hedges and shaded by a crooked birch tree. It appeared to be a forgotten place, with yellowed curtains and a sagging gate. After knocking twice, there was silence. Then the sound of footsteps broke. The spell. The door creaked open, and a thin, pale woman with white hair and watery eyes peered out. "Yes," Miss Linton said. With a gentle hiss from the stove, Violet shook uncomfortably, as if every movement cost her a thought. "Miss Marple, please forgive me. My name is Jane Marple, and I think we met years ago when you worked at the manor." I blinked slowly, remembering your face as you entered the room, which was dusty but clean, with the scent of lavender water lingering in the air. "You've come about, Evelyn," she observed blandly, as Miss Marple sat in a little armchair. "I have. What a sweetheart." Miss Marple tilted her head as Violet spoke in a sweet, soft voice. But something was clearly bothering her because of the way she tied her shoes. Normally, Violet would loop the laces twice, but this morning she did it 4 times, the sign of her nervousness. After a brief pause, Miss Marple said, "Tell me, Miss Linton." "Ah, she was," Violet finally answered, her voice trailing off, "but she died of scarlet fever. Her mother, Beatrix's sister, was devastated. She couldn't bear the loss. Was the Evelyn buried in the churchyard really Beatrix's niece? Then came the other child. The other child, Miss Marple asked in a whisper. A woman in a nurse's outfit cradled a baby wrapped in linen in a broken picture frame that Violet peered at as she faced the fireplace. With little more than her big blue eyes, she was abandoned at the infirmary, her name forgotten and unrecognized. Beatrice took the child in, named her Evelyn, and gave her the name of the one she'd lost. She told people they had misunderstood, saying the child had survived, not died. People accepted it. Who would dare question a Whitmore? Violet's lips quivered as she finished the sentence. Miss Marple finished the sentence. "Thank you, to keep the sorrow at bay, or, maybe, the estate undamaged." Miss Marple sat motionless while a switch was flipped. A kid was given a name that did not belong to her, and all of this was done in secret. Did Evelyn ever know? "I think perhaps she guessed," Violet whispered, her voice tinged with sadness. "I think someone found out that I received a parcel that morning, black lace. I asked who it was from, and she replied, 'Someone who wants me to remember who I really am.' The girl had been raised in silk, but she never truly belonged. At the wedding, Miss Marple had asked if Violet seemed afraid. Standing, Miss Marple gently placing a hand on Violet's shoulder, she expressed gratitude for the affirmation. However, as she ventured out into the gloomy afternoon, she sensed a deeper connection. It wasn't simply about the stolen names. There was someone out there who sought vengeance for the lie, and possibly someone else who utilized that information to assassinate half-sister, the protagonist of Chapter 4. By Thursday, the fog had lifted, but the village still felt a lack of clarity. Until the inquest was finished, Evelyn's body would remain at the undertaker's. Whispers started to get louder in the grocer's, at the post office, and even outside the church hall, with voices lowering whenever the name Whitmore was brought up. Someone would always add, "But she looked so well." Meanwhile, Miss Marple returned from Holly End Cottage with a mind full of shadows. As she sipped her evening tea, the woman from the back pew appeared. Her towering stature, long, narrow face, and deep-set grey eyes betraying a life built on another's name. Then, The bridal veil was delivered as a warning or a threat, and finally, death. She wore a simple brown coat, had her black hair pulled back into a neat bun, and held a little travel case. "I apologize for interrupting you," she whispered, "but I think you are Miss Jane Marple." "I am," said Miss Marple quietly. "My name is Clara Drew. May I come inside Miss Marple's parlour?" Clara did not remove her coat. She sat upright on the edge of the armchair, her eyes fixed on the mantelpiece, where a single photograph of Miss Marple's great-niece sat in a silver frame. "I was at the wedding," Clara said, her voice even but tight. "I wasn't invited. I came because I had to see her just once." Evelyn. Clara nodded. "She was my half-sister." Miss Marple paused only a moment before replying, "Go on, my dear. Our mother worked as a nursemaid during the war." Clara said she never spoke much of those days, but before she died last year, she told me something strange, that she had given birth to a child while working for the Whitmore, and that the child had been taken. Miss Marple, Miss Beatrice Whitmore, assured Clara of financial support, employment, and complete silence when she told her that she was helpless. My mother thought it was best because she was young and alone, but she never stopped wondering. Beatrice rechristened her Evelyn because the child's name was never officially recorded. It was evident which child was buried in the churchyard. The other appeared older and thinner. Their faces were similar but not identical. "I think the girl on the right is me," Miss Marple whispered to Clara as she nodded in agreement. "I located the first Evelyn's grave in the records, and then I discovered this." She opened her case and withdrew a photograph, a faded sepia portrait of two children sitting on a garden bench. Clara pointed out, "I don't remember it, but I found the photo among my mother's things, hidden in the lining of an old handbag." Underneath the portrait, which Miss Marple studied intently, were the initials B.W. for Beatrice Whitmore. "Most secrets never get the chance," Miss Marple replied with a gentle tone. "But your mother was brave to speak before she died. I didn't come to make a claim. I don't want money or land. I only wanted to know who she was." "But now she's dead," Clara said, her voice shaking with grief. "Kind," Miss Marple concluded. "Yes, and I don't think it was a coincidence." There was a long period of silence outside. The wind rustled the trees, and a dog barked twice before stopping. Clara leaned forward, her voice trailing off. "I believe someone wanted to kill Evelyn, not because of who she was, but because of what she wasn't." Miss Marple delicately placed the photo on the side table. "What makes you say that?" Clara hesitated before answering. "I saw your face when I looked at the veil. I recognized it. I said something, didn't I?" Clara's voice dropped as she whispered, "I know who you are." A new layer of truth emerged, and now everything was falling into place. If Evelyn had suspected the truth, if she had known her name wasn't actually hers, someone might have been afraid. "I don't think she knew I existed." Clara shook her head in response to Miss Marple's question. Nonetheless, another individual succeeded, according to Miss Marple. The veil was sent for a reason, to warn her or to silence her, but someone else may have taken advantage of the situation to make it permanent. Standing up, Clara went to the corner desk, opened a small drawer, and took out the folded note that she had stealthily placed on the church floor during the chaos. Upon seeing it, she knew it belonged to the true bride, but Miss Marple folded it again and asked, "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" After giving the inn a nod at Westcliff Road, Clara rested. "Your words have illuminated more than you realize, Miss Drew. However, I have a question for you. Had you been in Clara's shoes, would you have wanted her life?" She hesitated. and I used to agree with her until I beheld the beauty and sorrow in her eyes. Miss Marple observed her departure before returning her attention to the photograph. It depicted a tragic tale involving two girls, a grave, a gown, and a secret that had festered for an irretrievable amount of time. Miss Marple had always seen evil as a series of little cruelties, betrayals, and lies that built up over time. So, when Violet Linton told her that Beatrice Whitmore had kept a journal, she was taken aback. "It's in the upstairs drawer," Violet whispered, her voice shaking. "Beatrice never let me touch it, but I kept it because I thought it might explain everything. Now I sit at her desk by the window," Violet continued. The delicate pages of a weathered leather-bound book were turned by Miss Marple with care. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and lavender. The journal of Beatrice Whitmore was written in a tidy, solid, and flair-free style, typical of a woman who enjoyed having control over her own writing. The initial postings consisted of mundane weather notes, visits, and home repair tasks, but a change occurred later on. An early 1916 passage, partially obscured by a crossed-out line. "My sister's child is dead, Evelyn, such a little thing barely breathing. I did not cry, I only cleaned the room." The following page, though, was shocking, and Miss Marple halted. "Hilda Drew, a woman seeking employment, came today with a wool shawl covering her child. The girl's eyes were slate-colored, and when I asked her what she needed, she said a safe place. I offered her money, and she offered work. We exchanged offers, but there was no flourish or emotion, just cold truth. Another entry, I'll tell her that the kid is mine now. The Hamlet will adapt, Violet will be suspicious, but Evelyn is loyal and poor, so it's all good." With a frown, Miss Marple turned the page and read the confession. "Today, I signed the land deed ensuring Evelyn's inheritance. However, I do not expect to live very long. The doctor says the pain in my chest is not indigestion, as I had hoped. I must decide now whether to die knowing the truth or to bury it further. If she finds this journal, she will know that I loved her in my own way, but that she was never truly mine and that it was never hers." With a trembling hand, she scrolled. Through the entries, Clara was Hilda's last name. She mentioned it in a dream once. "If she returns, you must not allow her within." She desire irreplaceable items. Miss Marple delicately closed the book, her fingers resting on the cover. It was true that the child raised at the manor had never been Evelyn. The real one had died. Clara's half-sister, Beatrice, had been abducted and renamed. It was a life stolen, not out of kindness, but out of control. Maybe someone had tried to silence Evelyn when she finally tried to reveal it, preventing the truth from destroying everything. A clue in the frame led Miss Marple to visit the drawing room at Whitmore Manor, which was now locked and mostly empty, due to the death, although she still had friends. After Miss Marple painstakingly discovered his brother's missing bicycle years earlier, the caretaker, Mr. Barton, owed her a favour and refused to answer her question when she begged to be let in. Instead, he nodded and handed her the key. The chamber was dim, chilly, and replete with an oppressive stillness. Marple approached the fireplace and placed a portrait on the mantel. It was one of the few surviving family heirlooms. The picture depicted a young Evelyn, perhaps 10 years old, standing next to Beatrice in a velvet dress. However, the photograph had an unusual frame. The left edge was curled, as if something had been tucked behind it. Miss Marple delicately removed the backing, being careful not to damage the fragile paper on the other side. Inside, She discovered a faded letter with faded ink but still legible words. Tell her the truth that she was loved but not born under this name, that the girl in the ground is not her but the one before her, that it was not her fault. The note was unsigned, but its handwriting matched the journal's. Miss Marple placed the note in her handbag, contemplating its significance in light of the murder. Upon returning home, she lit a single lamp and knitted quietly, leaving her needles unfinished. The picture was becoming clearer. Someone had sent the veil to make Evelyn face the truth, but someone else had taken advantage of the situation to murder a tightening bodice. It was murder, not chance, that a wedding gown was created to look natural, as if the wearer were experiencing nervousness or fainting. Miss Marple considered Charles Denham, Evelyn's intended husband and inheritor of her land, as the party with the most to lose should Evelyn live long enough to speak. However, if the wedding had gone through and the truth about Evelyn's identity had come to light, the marriage might have been null and void, and the challenge to her inheritance would have been much easier. With this thought in mind, Miss Marple retrieved her notebook and jotted down a single name. There was always more to the narrative, so she created another Clara below it, and Charles. Clara said she didn't want money, but why did she show up now? How did she find the wedding date? Though the village of Lillingham stayed peaceful during Chapter 6. The laced needle, Miss Marple understood that even the most placid exterior could conceal a plethora of activity beneath. The subject of Evelyn's wedding gown persisted in her thoughts. Nobody had yet raised the question of how the bride had fallen so abruptly and painlessly, avoiding any signs of poisoning or injury. The coroner had settled on a generalized description of respiratory failure, which most had accepted. However, Miss Marple refused to accept this description because she recalled the chaos at the altar, with Charles struggling to fasten the buttons behind Evelyn's neck. The process had taken an excessive amount of time, and no one could explain why the veil had been so securely fastened. With nowhere else to turn but Mrs. Daltrey's dress, shopper, small shop situated just behind the what a week it has been for Evelyn. I haven't had much time to think about it since it happened. I dare say the village will talk about it for a while. Anyway, I wanted to ask Miss Marple about the wedding dress. I know Mrs. Daltrey wouldn't dream of it, either. She went with someone from London who said it was a gift, but it turned up a few weeks before the wedding. It's ridiculous that I thought leaving a gown that important to a complete stranger would be a good idea. Does anyone happen to know the name of the designer? Something French-sounding caught Mrs. Daltrey's nose. In my opinion, Madame Rousseau, tall, short-tempered woman who didn't sound French, spent a few days in the old Bluebell cottage taking measurements by candlelight. Then, the morning before the wedding, she disappeared without a word, even though she claimed to have worked alone. It seems strange that she never requested fittings, just measured, nodded, and said, "It will be ready." Miss Marple's pupils constricted slightly as she personally delivered the completed gown, large black trunk, devoid of any label or shop name, naved it with one of the bridesmaids, a nervous woman with freckles whose name evades Metha. Gown had arrived, sealed, and had been instructed not to be opened until the morning. As a result, Miss Marple felt her heart race as she waited for someone to examine it. No one bothered to ask questions or make adjustments. It was too late. After leaving the shop with a polite thank you, she headed down the path towards Bluebell Cottage. The cottage was deserted once more, its curtains drawn, and the faint aroma of faded lavender lingered from the cracked sill, like if a thread were unravelling. Not that Miss Marple was usually one to break into people's homes, but she remembered from 2 summers ago, while helping to rescue a stuck cat, that the back window of Bluebell Cottage never locked properly. As she peered inside, she noticed musty air, empty tea tins on the counter, a burned match in the fireplace, and the sewing table in the corner, which caught her eye. The top of the table was scratched but otherwise spotless, except for one thing, a needle that was still threaded, with a tiny mark of blue ink visible on the thread. In the corner of the room there was a swatch of leftover ivory silk fabric. When Miss Marple lifted it, she saw something even more disturbing. Her eyes widened as she reached into her bag and pulled out a magnifying glass. Underneath the thread there were initials stitched into it, but they were barely visible. Rather than Madame Roselle, the stitches' trace belonged to someone else. Tiny notches had been cut into the inside like measuring marks, but unnatural. She recognized them once. During the war, a newspaper had published a warning about women's corsets being modified to restrict breath as a form of silent torture, sabotaged. Garments, it said, most used for escape prevention in institutions. This was the same technique. The gown had been sewn to constrict, not to fit back at home that evening. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk with two items in front of her, a swatch of tight ivory silk with compression notches sewn by hand and the photograph of Clara and the real Evelyn hidden for years behind a portrait. She made a list who sent the veil, likely Clara to make. Evelyn asked questions. Who altered the gown? Someone else, someone with skill, someone posing under a false name. She wrote the initials, again RL, and suddenly she remembered something, a whisper from years ago. A young dressmaker who had left Lillingham in disgrace after a scandal involving another girl's wedding gown. She had changed her name, gone to London and trained in theatre costuming. Her name had been Ruth Lawson. Miss Marple rose. She would call the train station first thing in the morning. If Ruth Lawson had arrived recently, someone would have noticed. And a black, it's not just about seeking revenge. There are two plans brewing at once, one that seeks truth and the other that seeks silence. Poor Evelyn was caught between them, her bodice stitched shut before she could breathe. A small closing reflection, but something else stirred at the edge of her mind. A veil. A note, silent stitches, names hidden in graves and gowns. Looking out the dimming window, Miss Marple knew that she would soon find out who had strung the murder together. But she had to figure out who had pulled the last thread first. Section 7. The attic painting at the start of the day. There was fog, but by midday the sun had pierced the low clouds over Lillingham, lighting up the village rooftops in a pale light. However, inside Whitmore Manor, the air was heavy with silence, and the light barely reached the corners of the long, unused attic. Miss Marple, clad in her thick gloves and holding a brass-handled torch, stood at the base of the staircase. The caretaker, Mr. Barton, silently handed her the keys once more. He remained still, his eyes betraying a respectful observation. The attic door squeaked open, and dust lingered in the still air like snow. The floor squeaked under her cautious feet. Walls were adorned with boxes, vintage trunks, purses, a weathered cradle. But her attention was drawn to the large rectangular object in the far corner, which was wrapped in tarp. It rested against the wall, wedged between a stack of yellowed newspapers. She gently lifted the sheet to reveal a grand portrait that had weathered with the years. The subject, a young woman dressed in a nurse's uniform, sat before a fireplace, her expression grave, her hands folded over her lap. In the corner of her mouth there was an eerie familiarity, and in her arms, wrapped in white linen, sat a baby. Hilda Drew Clara, the mother of the baby, was clearly holding Bitotris, the baby she had taken. In the bottom corner of the canvas, barely visible in the scratched gold paint, were the initials RL, which were neither the artist's signature nor the artist's. Ruth Lawson had once again concealed her mark, but why? Miss Marple lowered her torch and peered behind the painting. Attached to the back of the frame was a fragile and yellowed slip of paper. Carefully, she opened it and found a final note. It read, "I never intended for you to wear the name. I stitched it over you like a mask, but masks come loose. When Clara approached me, she didn't ask for money, but a stage. I granted her wish, designing a gown that she would wear with pride. However, as the truth gradually revealed itself, the mask tightened, causing her to gasp until it could no longer contain her. Marple remained still for an extended period. That was more than a confession. It was a calculated act of vengeance. Ruth Lawson, the seamstress, had assisted Clara in creating a gown that would serve as a warning to Evelyn, reminding her to feel pressure rather than pain. The intention was for her to pause during the vows and perhaps back out in order to prevent the lie from becoming legally binding. As Miss Marple closed her eyes, a single word drifted through her thoughts. Charles. Later that afternoon, she returned to the Westcliff Inn, where Clara had been staying since her arrival. She gently knocked on room 4, but got no response. She tried again, but got no response. Finally, she approached the front desk, where the young clerk looked up from his crossword and shrugged. She had checked out earlier. He had mentioned that Clara hadn't left a note, paid in cash, or mentioned her whereabouts. She had the last question that evening. As the shadows lengthened across Church Lane, Miss Marple sat at her table. Once more, pen in hand, there were two conspiracies woven like threads. One had come to reveal the truth Clara threw. Ruth Lawson had arranged the veil and the gown, a symbolic gesture, an emotional trap, but the other had used the opportunity to commit murder. Miss Marple looked again at her notes. Clara sent the veil, Ruth made the gown designed to squeeze, not kill, but someone added a final twist, tightened the inner seams, sealed the bodice perhaps. Even tampered with the fastenings only someone with access the night before the wedding. Miss Marple circled a name, Charles Denham, the groom. He had motive. If Evelyn died before the vows, her estate would pass into trust under the Denhams' control, but had they married? And then the truth emerged, the inheritance could be contested, the veil revealed. A lie, but the dress buried it. Miss Marple stood lit her hallway lamp and reached for her coat. Tomorrow morning she would ask Charles a few gentle questions, but not alone. The police would be with her, quietly, politely, just in case, because a man who could kill with thread and timing, who could turn a seam into a noose, might not respond kindly when his stitches were finally unpicked. Chapter 8. The Truth in the Veil. The drawing room at Whitmore Manor had been closed since the day of the wedding. Now it was open once more, though not for celebration. The air inside felt thin, as though the house itself knew that it would not be leaving this day unchanged. As she sat by the fireplace, Miss Marple had a small folder on her lap. Charles Denham, pale and tight-lipped in his morning suit, sat across from her, elegant and composed. Her mother sat just behind him. The bridesmaids and Clara Drew were absent, but the room was full of memories. Thank you for agreeing to meet with Inspector Graves, who quietly summoned him from the county constabulary. Softly, Miss Marple remarked, I understand that this is a difficult time. Charles remained silent as she went on. I shall begin, if I may, with a lie that lived too long, involving a child named Evelyn Whitmore, who died at the age of 5 from scarlet fever. Her mother wept, and her aunt was grieving. Then, something very strange happened. Aunt Miss Beatrice Whitmore decided to adopt an orphan, gave her the name Evelyn, and raised her as her own. No one in the village, not even the girl herself, knew about it. Charles shifted slightly in his seat, but remained silent. That child, Miss Marple continued, grew up to become the young woman we all watched walk down the aisle in a gown. That killed her. Officer Graves looked up the photo of Clarara's mother holding the baby was taken from an attic portrait, which Miss Marple delicately removed from the folder. She was not the child of privilege, she said with a hint of sadness. But someone knew that someone meant to expose her. Not to harm, but to stop the wedding that someone was Clarara Drew, her half-sister. Miss Marple glanced up to see that someone had tinkered with the dress's design, turning it into a murder weapon. Mrs. Denham tensed up, sent a warning message through the veil of black lace, and enlisted an old friend, a dressmaker, to stitch a message into the gown's seams. The plan was simple. As Evelyn stood, the bodice would tighten slightly, not enough to kill, but enough to make her pause and reveal the truth. The dress inspector discovered a clever little trick involving tension cord and a spring press sewn directly into the spine of the garment when it was altered once again upon delivery. The seams were stitched tighter, and a loop at the neck was reinforced to constrict when the final button was fastened. The mechanism was hidden beneath the lining. A little evidence pouch, from which Graves removed a length of ivory silk with pinched indentations and darker thread, a trap, and set it on the table. At last, Charles's voice broke the silence. "Are you accusing Clarara of anything, Miss Marple?" Claimed Evelyn had never seen one until she stepped into the room. "The motive reveals as I accuse you, Miss Marple, while you remain calm as ever." The tone of Miss Marple's speech was always in a negative light, but there was an upside. If Evelyn died before the ceremony was over, the estate would go straight into her name and be outside your family's control. On the other hand, if she died before the ceremony was over, the land would go back into trust with your father and eventually you. Charles gazed at her expression, paralyzed with fear. She revealed that she had received a veil and showed it to you, expressing her fear. She may have even said, feeling like a fraud, but you caught on to her omission and terrified because someone knew the truth. You discovered the gown the night before the wedding, possibly while assisting Miss Marple with her preparations, and you noticed that it had an internal mechanism that could be tightened. After you finished the job, she pointed to the evidence pouch, and you stitched the last thread, added the fastener at the back of the neck, and transformed a warning into a weapon. You were the last unmasking inspector. As Charles prepared to speak, his mother gently grasped his arm and whispered, "Not here." Charles stood slowly, explaining that he needed more time and that Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. She died with her name in doubt, her breath cut short, and a man she trusted watching her fall. She spoke softly as she spoke. "You may call that an accident, I call it murder." After Charles was discreetly removed from the room, Graves nodded. In the churchyard, a new gravestone had been put near the old one. It bore no names, but a simple inscription. At the base of the grave, which belonged to 5-year-old Evelyn Whitmore, there were wilting violets. Knowing that Evelyn loved and lost for a moment, Miss Marple stood, her gloves tucked under one arm, her eyes fixed on the foliage. I hope she forgives me, because even though Clarara never came back, she did write a single letter and send it from the coast. Neither of us was who we really were, but for that brief while, we were inseparable. After folding the letter, Miss Marple slipped it back into her pocket. The mask had been undone, the curtain had been lifted, and now the truth could breathe.